Hello, health seekers. Welcome to another episode of the Keto Pro Podcast with myself, Richard Smith. Today, I'm joined with Alison Morgan, co-author of Why Vegans Have Smaller Brains. Alison, welcome on board.
Thank you very much, Richard. It's lovely to be here and talking to you. Thank you.
Super excited. Super excited. Let's get into this today. Alison, could you tell the listeners a little bit about yourself?
Yes. I'm an agricultural specialist. I've worked in agriculture as an advisor and a researcher for over 40 years. And lately, I've been busy the last few years writing this book with my two co-authors, Anita Tagore, who's a doctor and a nutritionist, and David Ellis, who's a geophysicist. So we published the book about a year ago, bringing together an understanding of both the impacts of different kinds of diets on our health and on the environment through the way that we farm different kinds of food. So that's my background.
Fantastic. Brilliant stuff. So, Alison, what are the key points? I mean, there's lots of common misconceptions, in my opinion, in regards to what healthy living is. I mean, and you mentioned, why vegans have smaller brains. I mean, is that factually true?
So the obviously the title is quite provocative, and it's also got the subtitle "And How Cows Reverse Climate Change," which is my part of the book. But yes, in terms of the way that is phrased, why vegans have smaller brains, we could say that going vegan leads to brain atrophy and brain shrinkage. Not that it's not meant as an insult to people that choose to go vegan, often for the best intentions, but it is factual that plant foods simply are deficient in many of the essential nutrients that we need as human beings because we evolved as carnivores. So it's deficient in vitamin B12, which you can only get from animal foods, DHA, and there's also lots of other things. And those deficiencies cause things like brain atrophy. So there's a lot of good evidence that in babies born to vegan women, vegan mothers, they often suffer brain atrophy, and it can only be reversed by giving vitamin B12, and in the DHA may be another factor in that, and also in older people. People who are vitamin B12 deficient tend to have accelerated brain atrophy as they age. So it's really important for us to eat animal foods, and the best, the best diet from my point of view is a diet based on all animal foods, ketogenic, which is what I mostly try to follow most of the time.
Yeah.
So yes, it's very dangerous.
And I agree, and I think you've hit the nail on the head. This isn't a dig at anybody's dietary choices. I mean, this is what I tend to find is lots of the clients that I work with now who have gravitated into a ketogenic-based carnivore lifestyle. Many of them are ex-vegan.
Yes,
it's almost because they've gone down this journey of. There's three reasons, in my opinion. And we can get into this. There's three reasons, in my opinion, one would become a vegan generally. One for the health of the planet. Second, animal cruelty. And the third is for their own health and well-being. Now, we can get into this. My opinion is that all of these are, if you want to be in optimal health, if you want to be in the best position to help the planet and animal cruelty, a carnivore lifestyle, it will tick all of these boxes. And I know that sounds crazy, and we can get into the reasons why, but my opinion is a true vegan is a carnivore. No? a true vegan is so for those reasons, a true vegan, if you really care about animal welfare, the planet, and your own health, then a carnivore lifestyle is optimal for all three of these.
Yes. If you're someone that wants to adopt a diet that is good for your health, the best optimum for your health, and also optimum for the environment and for minimizing animal death and cruelty, then the best diet to follow is an all-animal ketogenic diet based on pasture-reared meat. So that's mainly beef and lamb, which is, of course, the complete opposite of what we're being told. We're all being told we've got to go plant-based, and it's 100%. Completely wrong.
And I agree, but for the sake of the listeners, explain to me why. Why would eating animals be better for animals?
For animals, right? Yeah. So not all livestock production is optimum. I tend to avoid intensively reared meat and, as far as possible, intensively reared dairy. We'll come back to the question of dairy, but so the optimum meat is regeneratively reared, pasture-reared beef and lamb, despite the fact that they are ruminants that produce methane, and we're told that that's causing climate change. We can come back to that. But so intensively reared meat, like poultry meat, pig meat, most pigs and poultry are intensively reared. Not all. You can get organic pig meat, but basically most poultry and pig meat is produced on grain-based diets, usually with a lot of soya added, and it's the main environmental impact is coming from the growing of those grains and soya. And also then in terms of animal welfare, those are not ideal because the animals are generally housed, not always, but mostly housed. It's a less natural environment. And also there are issues with, the potential for water pollution and air pollution from those intensive livestock systems. Intensive dairying and most of our dairying is now quite intensive, and I'll talk about the reasons why we have gone that way, because we don't need to. So intensive dairying can also have a lot of environmental impacts and impacts on the welfare of the animal. But the most environmentally friendly and welfare friendly food is pasture-reared beef and lamb. And most of our beef and lamb in Britain is pasture-reared. Some of it is completely regenerative, or it may be organic. And even those that are on conventional systems, I spent most of my life working with farmers in all parts of this country with their beef herds, suckler beef herds mainly, and sheep flocks. And the inputs, the agrochemical inputs of artificial fertilizer and pesticides is the lowest of any farming system, even in conventional beef and lamb. And then if you go regenerative or organic, organic is better because you're only using natural organic manures, not using artificial fertilizers. And the regenerative is better again. So these are the best systems. And the other thing is in terms of animal death and suffering. This is actually quite a big subject. So in terms of if you are eating a diet based on beef, for instance, a beef cow is a big animal. So if I was just to eat beef, meat and fat from beef and organ meats, and that would be a completely healthy diet, I would be able to get all my nutrients just from that. I would only need to kill one animal in two to 3 years to meet all my dietary needs as a human being. For a bigger, fitter man, young man, or playing a lot of sport or something like that, you might need to eat a little bit more, but you're still talking about very few animals having to be killed. Whereas when it comes to crop farming, all crop farming is all crop farming that doesn't have livestock farming and grassland livestock farming incorporated in it, in the rotations, is very harmful because it's completely dependent on fossil fuels and agrochemicals. And I can talk a little bit about the reasons why we've gone that way with our crop farming. We've changed dramatically in the last 80 or 100 years in the way that we farm. But for crop farming, growing wheat and oil seeds and sugar beet and vegetables, all those crops are very, very harmful to the environment. And in terms of animal life, you have to protect the crop, because if you're going to harvest the crop and maximize your yield, you don't want animals eating it. So actually, we shoot and poison and trap millions and millions of animals to protect crops, far more animals than are killed for somebody eating just beef, like me and you. So, in this country, all our bird species are protected by law. So you and I can't go out and just shoot them for any reason. But nevertheless, farmers are licensed or can license other people to come onto their land and shoot millions of birds to protect their crop. So, they go out shooting around about 3 million just wood pigeons in this country every year, just to protect crops. Wow. And that's just one species of bird. Then we've got all the other species in this country. Ducks and geese and jays and crows and, just millions and millions of birds being shot. And sometimes, and then there's poisoning of rodents, the shooting of rabbits and hares to protect crops and deer. So we shoot around about 350,000 deer each year. And that's mainly to protect crops, not entirely to protect crops, because they also do a lot of damage to ancient woodland, and that threatens bird species like nightingales. So we do need to control deer, and they don't have any predators because we haven't got any wolves anymore. So we do need to control some animals, or else, we reintroduce wolves or something. But so it's just to point out that there's an awful lot of death and suffering in crop agriculture, and that's just the larger species that you can see. Then we come to the small things that most of us don't notice very much. So we've all heard that phrase that, we don't see the bugs splattered on our windscreens in summer anymore. We're just not seeing those insects splattered on our screen, and we're not seeing the number of insects around, and we're also seeing a decline in bird life over the recent decades, and it's actually true. It's not just not an observation. There've been some major studies now that have shown that flying insect populations have declined by 80% in the last 30 years. There was a German study, very long-term, good German study, published in 2017. Then other studies by Rothamsted Research in Britain, which is a highly renowned agricultural research organisation and environmental research organisation. They're all coming out with the same kind of figures, around about 80% reduction in flying insect populations. And then also in earthworms. And the main reason for this is crop production. So many people are aware that or many people, or ordinary people who aren't involved in farming, have say how awful it is for farmers to use pesticides, and we shouldn't be using pesticides. But what they don't realize is that 99% of those pesticides are used on crops, not on pasture-reared animal farming. So less than 1% is used in animal production. And we have really good pesticide data in this country. So we know where these pesticides are being used. And the amount of pesticides has dramatically increased in over recent years. So that's going on to arable cropland for vegetables and grains and all those things. And it is decimating our insect populations and our earthworm populations. So this is the root cause. Crop farming is the root cause of this loss of insects, the main cause. The other aspect of crop farming that's really damaging, again, for insect life and other animal life, is because it just eradicates the habitat. You've just got monocultures with almost nothing else around, despite years and years of environmental schemes where farmers do these things. They are good at abiding by policy and doing what they've been told to do. We've had set aside. We've had farmers take measures to protect water courses and put around the field margins where they don't sow crops and everything. But it's the basic thing is that we have just got monocultures of arable crops one after another, and just eradicating the habitat that our wildlife needs. And what happens is, those tiny creatures, the insects and other creatures, they're the basis of the ecosystem, and the earthworms and all the soil organisms are the basis of the ecosystem. And then all the birds that feed on them are then being affected both by loss of habitat and the pesticides that they pick up from the environment. And then, other animals are also, numbers of other animals are also being affected. So this is what's happening with crop production. And I think I've had a kind of really, as I look back on my working life, I've had a really valuable insight into that, because most people tend to go into crop farming or livestock farming advice. And in my case, I started off, I read agriculture at Reading University, general agriculture, so I did both crops and livestock. And I've also done global development as postgrad studies and worked overseas. But I began life focused mostly on grazing livestock and in research, so applied research, government research. And then when I was in my mid-20s, I had to move to the east of England to live in Lincolnshire, because I got married and my husband was an agronomist, and so we went there. And I found myself having to do crop advice. I had to change tack and become a crop advisor, an agronomist in Lincolnshire for a few years. And I was told that there were no livestock there. There are some, but mostly it's just continuous cropping. And it's just devastating to the environment. Despite the fact that, some very, very good farmers do care about the environment, many of them, most of them. But around the edges of all that cropland, there's always some land that can't be cropped. We call that marginal land. And, 2/3 of Britain is marginal land, especially in the west and the north of Britain. But even in the east of England, there is some land that cannot be cropped. And I found that there were suckler beef herds there, and sheep flocks occasionally, and lots of sheep coming down from the hills into the fens in the autumn time to graze on the brassica waste in particular. So what I realized was that those animals, that animal farming was doing a lot of good, and it's the crop farming that incorporates all the harm. And what most people don't realize, because, you know, around about 2% of our population are now involved in farming, you know, a massive reduction in the number of people who are actually engaged in farming and have any understanding of what's involved in farming over the last century or two. So most people just, in their view of what's involved in farming is that green is good. It's very simplistic. They have no understanding of how crops are grown, and it's most crops. So, and they don't seem to understand the history of farming, because if we just go back to the post-war years, or just go back around about a century, and particularly to the post-war years in the 50s onwards, we've had since then a massive change in the way that we farm, and particularly in the way that we farm crops. So traditionally in the past, before the coming of fossil fuels and agrochemicals, all farmers knew, and most people realized, that you have to have grass and livestock in the rotation of your crops. So if you want to grow wheat, well, you would have grown wheat for a year, maybe two, and then you either let it go fallow and it greens over with weeds, and you graze it with livestock, or you put grass lay into it. A lay means a short-term grass, like just for a year or two. So you'd put a grass lay into it and graze it with cattle or sheep. And there's lots of manure going on. If you've got pigs as well, the manure from them would be going on. And because the arable crop takes fertility out of the soil, it's taking carbon out of the soil. And it's damaging the soil structure. Ploughing in particular is very damaging and causes a lot of loss of carbon. And that carbon is going into the air. It's being, because when we expose soil to grow arable crops, we're turning the soil over, we're exposing the organic matter to the air, and the air oxidizes the carbon in that organic matter, and it just goes up into the atmosphere as CO2. We've lost around 20% of the carbon from our soils worldwide since we began farming. And of course, farming is a recent thing. And the plough was only invented 4,000 years ago. But it's not just the ploughing that's harmful. So it's what we've done is we have delinked arable crop farming from livestock farming, and that linkage was very, very important for the environment. So historically, as I say, we would have had rotations in which you grew an arable crop and then you put it back into grass and livestock. And the livestock manure and the grazing and the grass put carbon back into the soil. They literally reverse carbon loss from the soil and take carbon out of the atmosphere and put that carbon into the soil. So the subtitle of the book is literally true, that cows reverse climate change, because the pasture, the grassland plants that they're on are putting carbon into the soil. The grazing itself stimulates that carbon transfer, sequestration into the soil. And the manure from the animal is also going into the soil. Either we put it on as farmyard manure, or the cattle grazing are just depositing it on that, and that dung is taken underground by dung beetles and other organisms very rapidly, so it's incorporated into the soil quite rapidly. When you've got a crop, you're just losing carbon and you're eradicating the environment. And also you get a build-up of crop pests and disease and weeds. And by putting a grass lay and livestock back into the rotation, that breaks that cycle of build-up of disease and pests and weeds. So this is the way that we used to farm. But then when we began to get diesel fuel and big machinery for crop production, and the production of artificial fertilizers and pesticides, herbicides, insecticides, fungicides, all these things. And those are all based on manufacturing using fossil fuels. They're very, very high emissions from the manufacture of artificial fertilizers and pesticides. About 5% of the emissions globally are caused by the production of fertilizer. So crop production without animals is entirely dependent on that. And what we just didn't understand in the post-war years, the whole government policy was all about food production, increasing food production, making ourselves more self-sufficient, because we'd been a nation that was threatened with starvation during the war. So it was all about, increasing yield. So there was a change, especially in the east of England, but anywhere where you can grow arable crops, where the soil and the land is suitable for that. We converted to rotations that were just continuous crops, and we took grass and livestock out of those rotations. So if you go to the east of England today, it's very rare that you'll see grass in the rotation. It's usually wheat, barley, oilseed rape, potatoes, brassicas, and all those, that system of cropping is entirely dependent on lots of fossil fuel and artificial pesticides and agrochemicals. And anyone that knows about organic farming, or even just, growing plants growing vegetables in your back garden, you know that what we do is put manure on mostly. It's all about manure. So livestock restore the fertility of the soil, and they help to reduce the buildup of disease. So they help to reduce the use of agrochemicals in crop production, and they're absolutely essential for organic or regenerative farming systems that are the most beneficial. So we've been told this story about we should all be eating plant foods, and we should reduce our consumption of meat, and we're told that we should be ploughing up grassland for livestock production and turning it to wheat, turning it to arable land. This is absolutely catastrophic for emissions, for soil damage, and for wildlife. And there's very good evidence to support that. For instance, Anita and Dave and I recently met with Professor Andy Neal from Rothamsted Research, who's a soil specialist, and there's a lot of research that he and his colleagues at Rothamsted and elsewhere have done, which show that just farmers in the west of England, which traditionally livestock areas, and Wales as well, being encouraged that they're going to need to take their land out of pasture and convert to arable cropping. One ploughing has been shown to reduce the carbon content of the soil from 5.7% to 3.3%.
Wow.
So nearly half of the carbon is being lost just by the initial ploughing. And the only way to return that is to put grass back in, and especially grass with livestock and livestock manure on it. So we're going in completely the wrong direction. And the other thing that always amazes me, you know, there's a lot of there's a fad at the moment for tree planting, and there's a fad for rewilding. And don't get me wrong, I love trees, and I understand that they're very beneficial. And I love wildlife, so it's great if we can reintroduce species that we've lost, and there's quite a lot of that going on around me in Somerset. But where we need to be planting trees and rewilding is the east of England, where all the arable cropping is, not on grassland. Yes, there's a form of farming that's called wood pasture, sometimes known as, it's a form of silviculture, where you have trees planted interspersed in pasture, and you have the cattle or sheep grazing the pasture beneath the trees, and that's really good. So you've got a combination of trees and pasture. But grassland itself is a hugely important environment, especially for soil and for carbon. We mustn't lose these grasslands, but we're being told we need to plough them up because we need to be all eating plant foods, and it's nonsense. We need to go the other way and put livestock and grass back into our arable rotations.
Yeah, 100%. I completely agree. It's you know, you mentioned about the emissions and things, you know, there, you know, the methane claims, you know, against cattle farming. I mean, it's probably 2% is coming from beef farming. I mean, those are the figures that were reported, at least, you know, a number of years ago. I think all agriculture was around, was it like maybe less than 4%?
So
3.9?
it depends. It depends which reports you read, you see. So the figures and understanding what those figures really mean. So in the UK, total emissions from, and we're just talking about emissions here. So emissions of greenhouse gases from agriculture as a whole is around about 9 or 10% of our UK emissions, recorded as in on the government records for that, and they're roughly half and half from livestock and from crop production. So, and the thing is that pasture-reared livestock, so this is mainly beef and lamb, ruminant livestock, they are doing something that crops cannot do. They are sequestering carbon back into the soil. So they actually mitigate the loss of carbon. So actually, livestock farming in this country is producing less emissions overall. And if we get better at managing, because there are ways of improving the way that we manage pasture-reared livestock to improve carbon sequestration, but crop production loses carbon for all sorts of reasons, you know, and it's not just carbon. What should we talk a little bit about methane?
Look, 100%. I mean, it's, you know, we look at these things as being the greenhouse gases as being something that is detrimental, but you know, greenhouse gases are natural. They have the benefits. I mean, they absorb infrared radiation from the sun and warm the surface of the planet. You know, without greenhouse gases, you know, we wouldn't, well, the planet would be freezing essentially and inhabitable for life, wouldn't it? So these things are
we'd be heading for another ice age now.
100%. You know, and I think our understanding of these gases is, in my opinion, being very, very poor and being manipulated. You know, we're led to believe that these things are detrimental. And you mentioned about, you know, the carbon cycle with the cattle. I mean, it is carbon negative, isn't it? It's no
Yes.
new carbon is created when we use
Absolutely.
regenerative farming, and that's
Yes.
the difference.
So there are two carbon cycles, and I'm not an expert in fossil fuel side of emissions and things, but basically there are two different carbon cycles. So there's the slow carbon cycle, which is a geological system where over billions of years plant and animal material has been deposited and pressurized, and it turns into fossil fuels, oil and gas and these things, which have been under the ground or under the ocean for all those years. And now, in the last couple of 100 years, we've been digging those up and burning them. So there's a rapid release of carbon dioxide and methane and nitrous oxide into the atmosphere from the burning of those fuels. Now, I'm not going to get into the whole issue of climate change from that, but that's a slow cycle. So it takes a long time for those gases to be put back into underground, and we're releasing a lot of them very fast. But where methane from ruminant animals is concerned, it's a completely different matter. Yes, the methane is chemically the same as the methane from fossil fuels, and yes, methane does warm the atmosphere, but ruminants do not add any methane or carbon to the atmosphere because it's a cycle. It's a short cycle as well. It takes between 7 and 12 years to complete the cycle. And what happens is, if we start from the beginning, we've got carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Plants photosynthesize and take that carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere when they photosynthesize. So plants are extracting carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Those plants convert that carbon dioxide into carbohydrates. That might be cellulose or sugars or lignin in their plant tissues. And if you've got a grazing animal like a beef cow or a sheep grazing on grass, it is eating carbon in the form of carbohydrate, sugars and cellulose and so on. So the plant is removing carbon dioxide, and it is also exuding some sugars into the soil from its roots. So there is a net reduction in the amount of carbon dioxide coming out of the atmosphere. And also the animal that is eating the plants, it's turning that carbon into its own body tissues, so it's storing carbon in its own body tissues for part of the time. And it's also turning a lot of that carbon into manure, which is going back underground. So there's a net downward movement of carbon into the soil. With ruminant animals like cattle and sheep, they do produce methane. They belch it out. They don't fart it out, they belch it out. Because the rumen is the first stomach in a ruminant. It has 4 stomach compartments, and it produces the microorganisms in its rumen break down cellulose in order to digest the plant food, and they belch out methane, which is a byproduct from those microorganisms. But that methane breaks back down to carbon dioxide in about 7 or 10 years, around about 10 years on average. So it just breaks back down into carbon dioxide. And yes, of course, carbon dioxide is also a warming gas, but all you've done is replace some of the carbon dioxide that the plants took out in the first place. And you haven't replaced all of it, because some of the carbon has gone down into the soil and into the animals' tissues and into the plant tissues. So there's a net reduction. So this is what's happening with ruminant, and it's just a flux gas. It's not adding to that to the methane or carbon in the atmosphere, and they're actually doing a lot of good by sending carbon down, sequestering carbon. And the grazing action of the plant also stimulates the plants to exude more sugar into the soil. So the grazing actually works with the plant. So it's actually better to have grazed pasture than to just have pasture that hasn't got any livestock on it, or pasture that you cut. So that's what's happening with methane, and it's complete nonsense. We've had ruminants on this planet for 50 million years, and there are lots of wild ruminants that we, are just totally ignored. And so, climate scientists recognize that even if you removed all the ruminants, all the livestock ruminants and all the wild ruminants from the planet, you would have very little impact on emissions, and actually you'd be doing a huge amount of harm, because if we remove grazing livestock, pasture-reared livestock, then and convert all that to arable, you've got a massive increase in emissions and no carbon sequestration. So grasslands are really important, because they're after peat soils. Grassland soils are they store the most carbon, because they're always covered, especially with it permanent pasture, that is never ploughed up. They are those grasslands store the most carbon, and when we plough them up, we are just losing masses of carbon.
Which is scary. I mean, we many years ago we found this out by ploughing, didn't we? That it releases the carbon and helps us grow these crops, but each time we further reduce, essentially desertifying the soil. Yes. And eventually, I mean, the soil that we see today is going to be nothing but desert.
Yeah.
How many years do you think we have left in regards to ploughing fields and trying to grow crops before that land is essentially desertified?
It depends where you're talking about, but we've lost I think it's around about 75% of the topsoil in East Anglia.
Wow.
Now. So how long have we got left? We're desertifying our soils all the time. Most of North America is also at high risk. Most of the world, we're seeing all over the world is this happening, so it's really harmful, and we're losing our peat lands as well, and our wetlands. So peat is very high in organic matter, very high in carbon, the highest kind of soil. Most of our peat soils in Britain are in East Anglia, in the fens. We've lost most of those, and we're losing peat at the rate of 2 centimeters per year. And that's because we're exposing the peat to grow crops or to cut peat. Every time you expose the peat and remove the vegetation, you're getting massive loss of carbon, and the peat shrinks. There is peat in upland soils as well, where we mainly graze livestock, on the moors and things, and on the sunset levels not far from where I live. And yes, livestock farming can also cause damage to peat and damage to soil in general. So I'm not saying that livestock farming never causes damage, but it doesn't need to. So we can we can do a lot of, we can look at the way that we are farming livestock, in particular regenerative grazing systems like mob grazing, and just not ploughing, when we don't need to plough for beef and sheep, and even for dairying. But there's, since the war years, there's been this emphasis on increasing yields both of crops and of livestock, and so this is what's led to things going the way that they have, and to this loss of carbon in particular over the last few decades, and the decimation of our insect life and wildlife in general. So that's maybe I should talk a little bit about Dartmoor and where animals do cause damage and why that has occurred.
100%. I think, just to tie this up in a neat little bow, I think it's when I used to grow vegetables in my garden, when I was ketogenic, I've never been vegan, but I was heavily plant-based. I was a heavily plant, I'd say plant, not plant-based, but I was plant-heavy.
Yeah.
Because I believed that this is where the nutrients came from. So I used to grow all sorts of fruits and vegetables in my garden, and I would try to do the most natural things that I could in order to grow these. But what I've quickly found was that I could not grow anything in my garden without causing some harm to some sort of predator, whether it was slugs or any, whatever it may be, little creatures coming in to eat my little crops that I was growing. And this is the case, isn't it? Many will think that just because we are not using, so the organic farming would be the argument for most people. Well, we don't use pesticides, but I mean, what you're saying there essentially is when we constantly turn over this soil to grow crops, we're releasing the carbon, we're killing the whole ecosystem. We're killing the microbes, we're killing the insects, therefore the birds die off and the predators that eat the birds. So we are quite literally destroying a whole ecosystem. But because we are not consuming that animal directly, we believe that we're not causing harm to animals. But in fact, as you say, it's considerably higher, way more. And I think it's genuinely untrackable. So I did a podcast last year based on the amount of deaths caused by a carnivore lifestyle compared to a vegan lifestyle.
Right.
And this was heavily researched. It was my own work. And what I found, and I didn't account for the deaths to the birds through glyphosate or any other herbicide, because it was in the millions and millions. So I even took this out. At the very basic, what I came to was that a vegan lifestyle, the strictest vegan lifestyle done in the best means, caused over 20 times more deaths than a carnivore lifestyle. And that is heavily biased towards the vegan lifestyle. And this isn't me having a dig at the vegan community. This is purely based on animal health and welfare. And you mentioned about, a lion diet. It's a cow would feed me for well over a year. I eat a lot. But that's one death, essentially. And what I came to, the conclusion that I came to when I was growing my fruits and vegetables was that you can't have life without death.
Absolutely. And it's, the reason that I went into the kind of career that I have was as a child, I just loved being in nature and loved being around animals. And so it may, to a vegan, they might think, well, that's very strange, going into a kind of agriculture as an advisor that involves killing animals. But there's some Australian research that shows that for every kilo of protein from plants, you have to kill about 25 times as many animals as you would have to kill for 1 kilo of protein from beef. And that's undoubtedly true, because and also we don't take account of the animal life that cattle and sheep farming encourages. Most of our cattle and sheep farming is very extensive, very little agrochemicals going on to it. They're just mostly out at pasture. And they actually encourage habitat that creates wildlife. So we've seen the disappearance of huge numbers of wild species, especially in the east of England, whereas in the west of Britain, where you've got more pasture land and hill and upland, that's where there is more wildlife. And maybe one of the things that I talk about in the book is the badger story. Everybody's up in arms about the culling of badgers. And yes, I love badgers, and I don't want to see them being killed. And whether you agree with that or not, with the culling, which has now stopped incidentally, but we were culling about, I think it was about 20,000 badgers a year, almost almost all of the TB problem, bovine TB problem, is in the southwest of England and South Wales. So 20,000 badgers, but we're shooting 350,000 deer, mainly to protect crops. And the other thing is to understand, this is where you have to stop thinking simplistically and think about the whole system. So the reason that bovine TB and badgers, the reason that we have had cull badgers in the southwest of England and South Wales, or the reason that badgers are involved in TB in cattle, is because we have a lot of badgers in this region of the country. And the reason we have a lot of badgers is because cattle create the perfect habitat for them. They create lots of food for them because, cattle dung encourages beetles and insects and worms. Grassland encourages lots of worms. And that's what badgers live on. And in cattle land, you have hedges and trees and things, the kind of environment that badgers love, and also maize, which is not something I particularly like, but badgers love maize as well, which a lot of dairy farmers will grow. So if you go to the east of England, there are hardly any badgers. And the reason is because their habitat and their food sources have been destroyed by crop farming. So don't tell me that it's cattle that are killing badgers. Or threatening badgers. It's crop farming. If we put grass and livestock back into the east of England and crop farming, we'd have more badgers and more hedgehogs and wildlife in general. So yeah, there's all the different aspects of why pasture-reared livestock is so much better for wildlife and for animal life in general. And we're talking about many species that are threatened and at risk, whereas cows and sheep are not threatened and are at risk. Yes, we eat them, but so yes, they have to be killed to eat them. But in this country, it's humane slaughter, whereas shooting and poisoning is not very humane. And the poisoning of quadrillions of insects is not humane. We just don't think about it, but they are. There's lots of research that shows that insects and earthworms and so on are sentient. So, and the way that they die as a result of poisoning by pesticides is not good. If you imagine, nerve toxins used on humans, we know that is not a pleasant way to die. So these are the stories that we need to change and get people thinking about. Yes, I totally understand that people choose to go vegan or vegetarian because they think it's kinder to animals, because they think it's better to the environment. And I've been accused of being unkind because I eat meat. And I've got a lot of vegetarian and vegan friends who have no involvement in farming, have no understanding of how farming and the environment works and the impacts of the different systems. But the most ethical and humane diet is pasture-reared meat.
I completely agree. And I think that there's a disconnect, isn't there? In regard, you mentioned when we first came on the call, like caged hens and stock essentially that is caged and confined, and we don't agree with any of these things. I don't eat any of those meats. I shop once a week in my local butcher. My local butcher has his own farm, which is about 5 miles away. So the furthest my food travels basically is probably 5 to 10 miles, all locally sourced, pasture raised, regenerative farming, and it's very, very low impact on the environment, if anything at all. I don't buy caged eggs. I don't buy any. I try to avoid meats from any other source that I'm not familiar with where it's come from. So essentially, we want the same thing. We agree with the same thing as our friends from the vegan community. And as we mentioned when we came on the call, many of the carnivores today were once vegan. They've gone down this health journey. They've gone down the rabbit hole of research, and everything that you've just mentioned sort of comes to light through their research. And then they realize that the best way forward is to become more animal based.
Yeah. It's the how, not the cow.
It's I like it.
Yeah.
I like it.
Yeah.
But it's easy to understand. I mean, I once believed also that, if I eat meat, I'm causing harm, but it just isn't true, is it? It's factually incorrect.
All food production causes some harms, but the as we've said, the optimum system is livestock production. It's pasture reared meat, and that's basically ruminant meat. And as we've said, that's not a problem in terms of emissions, and it's very beneficial for the wider environment. And of course, what we need to be doing in farming is, we need to be getting the message across of how to do livestock farming in an optimum way. So, for instance, I'm a member of an organization called Pasture for Life, which is a great organization. A lot of regenerative farmers and pasture-based farmers that understand this system. And we're talking about how you graze animals. So if we look at the question of Dartmoor, which is often used as a stick to beat the livestock farmers with, the cattle farmers and the sheep farmers with, Dartmoor has been badly damaged for a number of decades now. And I worked on Dartmoor back in the 90s, looking at the environmental damage and talking to the livestock farmers. But as I say in the book, Dartmoor has been grazed by cattle and sheep farmers for 5,000 years. It was those farmers, the graziers, that created the moorland environment, the moorland ecology, which is really valuable ecology. And yes, it has been damaged. It has not been sheep-wrecked, as some people like to say. But when you look at the root causes of the damage, so we talk about overgrazing, too many animals, and that is true, that has happened. And also the way that they're being grazed. So on the southwest moors, Dartmoor and Exmoor, traditionally, we farmers used to keep the native breeds that were native to the southwest, so the Devon cattle, Dorset Devon sheep, and these kind of breeds. But in the last 100 years, they have been encouraged to change over to hardier northern breeds, so the Scottish Galloway cow and the Scottish blackface sheep, because those animals can be left out in the winter time and don't come down don't have to be brought down to house them, because they're hardier than those native breeds. But traditionally, until I can't remember exactly the date, but until about the middle of the last century, there were laws, bylaws and things about the way that cattle and sheep were grazed. So they had to be brought down off the moor in winter. And they had to come down in the autumn and be housed. And you could everyone that had grazing rights on the moor could only keep the number of cattle and sheep that they could house and keep at home, or keep on load and pasture at home in the winter time. So that really restricted the number of animals that were grazing the moor. And also it rested the moor at certain times. And also the way that they grazed was there was more movement in. So we know that set stocking really damages the plant life and damages the roots of the plant. And in other environments, that leads to desertification. So this is what happened, and all this has been driven by policy changes. Farmers have been really good at doing what they've been told to do by the policymakers. So we shouldn't be blaming farmers for this. We should be looking at the policy and getting the policy right. And that goes across the whole agricultural practice. So we had the Agriculture Act in 1948, which was all about increasing production. So farmers were encouraged to keep more and more animals on the moor. The restrictions about taking them down in the winter were removed. And also they delinked grazing rights from the holding in the lowland. So most of these farmers would have had a lowland holding and used the moor, and only been able to graze the number of animals that they could keep on their lowland holding in the winter time. So they delink that. So suddenly you've got a huge increase in livestock, especially sheep. And it's been the EU. The EU has been responsible for a lot of that damage. So it's policy. So, when we joined, so there was the Agriculture Act, first of all, in 1948, that was driving food production, and there was very little environmental legislation at that time. Then we go into the EU, and suddenly there are payments for producing higher yields of crops and keeping more livestock. And this has led to a lot of these environmental damages. And subsequently, really there wasn't all that much. I started work as an agricultural advisor in 1983. And at that time, there wasn't very much environmental regulation, and there wasn't, certainly from the government advisory services that I worked for then, and the research farms that I worked for, there wasn't much emphasis on environmental management. It just wasn't something that people were thinking about, even in the early 80s. But by the 90s, environmental regulation was starting to come in, especially from the EU. And suddenly what's happened is that farmers are being bludgeoned over the head, really, with being told that they're damaging the environment, being told that they've got to abide by lots of environmental legislation, and lots of bureaucracy and red tape that they have to manage. And at the same time, are prices for their products have been driven into the ground. So they have not increased over the years. So they're being told that they've got to be competitive, they've got to be market orientated. So they're caught between the devil and the deep blue sea, really, because they've got to manage the environment and abide by all this legislation at the same time as competing with food imports and everything else. So, and that goes for all kinds of farming, crop farming as well. We've seen very, very cheap food prices. And, most people that aren't involved in farming think that food prices should be lower. And there's quite a lot of, and farmers are blamed for it causing environmental damage. But in fact, the prices that the farmers get at the farm gate are very low. And food prices have been held very low for years. So we need to address that. Farmers need to be paid for what they produce. So for instance, there was a PhD study done in recent years looking at what's happening on Dartmoor and what's causing the damage and this kind of thing. And when you look at the income of upland hill and upland farmers, beef and sheep farmers, their income is, I think it was something like 22,000 a year for an average farm. And most of that was coming from EU subsidies, from the basic payments and environmental schemes. Almost none of it was coming from what they were able to sell in terms of the beef and the lamb. So when we're now with Brexit and everything else, we're removing those basic payments, removing and also our government has not been very good at replacing the schemes, the environmental schemes for the EU. We're still in a bit of a hiatus in terms of what farmers are going to be asked to do, and there are a lot of cuts to that. So it's just putting, livestock farming generally especially beef and sheep farming, is the lowest income, lowest profit form of farming. It's the grains and the vegetable production where you've got higher incomes. So we're driving, this mismatch of policy is driving farmers to either go out of business or to farm intensively. So we've got to address this and understand it and stop giving farmers mixed messages from policy. And we have to understand the value of our food, especially meat. It's the most nutritious and high value food. We really need to address that as a population. And I know we've got, a lot of people think they can't afford meat, and and there are many people in poverty who are struggling to make ends meet and to feed themselves or feed their children and so on. I understand that, but we've got to address that in a different way, not by making farmers who are producing the good food pay for it. So government needs to get real on this, I think,
It's interesting you mentioned the cost there, because I find it cheaper living on an all meat lifestyle. I mean, I go to my local butcher once a week.
Yeah.
I spend £50 to £60. So I buy in bulk. So I do get things a little cheaper. I buy cheaper cuts. So ribeye is the one that gets all of the airtime, isn't it, within our community? I can't afford ribeye. It's too expensive. Sirloin, too expensive. Rump is a little bit cheaper, so that's doable. But mince meat or ground beef, incredibly nutrient dense, very, very cheap. Organ meats, ridiculously cheap, incredibly nutrient dense. But my go-to is chuck. my butcher buys in the joint or gets it in from the farm, gets it in for me, and I will take the full joint, but this big, between myself and a friend of mine, and we'll probably have 12 to 15 very, very large steaks out of this, and that will last me the week, and that costs me 50 to 60 pounds, and that feeds 3 people.
Yeah.
So if we look at the cost, I mean, how much is a takeaway? When I was living the lifestyle that I did previously, I would go to Domino's Pizza. I would buy 2 pizzas. That would cost me 30 to 40 pounds. You know, a takeaway in, you know, a fast food takeaway, that would cost 30 to 40 pounds in one meal. And you think, well, this amount that we spend on this fast food can quite literally feed, you know, a small family for
and it's not even just the fast food. If you look at the price of vegetables, you know, if I go to buy vegetables in the supermarket or, you know, and I live in a market town in Somerset, you know, if I go to the greengrocers, there's no organic veg. Most of it is imported fruit and veg. So the environmental damage that is causing is massive. If I go to one of the supermarkets locally, yes, I can get some organic veg if I wish to buy any veg. You know, maybe somebody's visiting. But you look at the wastage. So I had family here a couple of weeks ago for Sunday lunch, you know, and the amount of food wastage that had to go out the next day compared with what I normally produce, where I'm literally putting eggshells and tea leaves into my food waste. There's almost nothing else. And so all the animal foods, the meat and everything that I'm buying, is going to nourish me and not going into the waste pit. So and we see this also, this waste issue. You know, vegetables, even non-organic vegetables, are incredibly expensive. I went to buy a cauliflower. I think it was £1.80 or something for a small cauliflower. And that's got almost no nutrition in it, and plus lots of anti-nutrients. You know, people, if you're buying things like frozen pizzas just to eat at home, even without going for the fast food, it's very low in nutrition, and it's expensive. Any bread can be expensive. You know, we're all encouraged to eat sourdoughs and whole grains and all these things. And you know, I went all down that route when I started my journey, and thinking that I was doing better by eating sourdoughs and things like that. But the other thing to, you know, just to add that fits in with this is, in terms of food waste, the other thing that people don't take account of is that animals, livestock, recycle and upcycle huge amounts of food waste produced by crops. So when I was in Lincolnshire, you know, acres and acres of brassicas being grown, they produce huge amounts of wastage that just ends up, you know, when they harvest the cauliflowers or the cabbages or whatever, there's a huge amount of wastage left on the land, the stalks and the outside leaves and everything, even before we take off outside leaves ourselves at home, you know. So that all ends up just being left on the land. So what happens is, in those areas, they bring down tens of thousands of sheep in the autumn that graze all that brassica waste and turn it into meat and turn it into dung that goes back onto the soil, so that they improve the soil and don't have to use so much fertilizer for those very you know, brassicas are very demanding of fertilizer requirements if you don't put animals on. So straw is, and lots of byproducts used all over the world, going from crop waste and byproduct into animals. So animals are really important for that, because they're reducing emissions from those byproducts as well. So yeah, I find my own food costs my weekly food costs went down dramatically when I went onto a, we call our diet in the book, we call it the Sapiens diet, which is paleo keto diet, as described by the Paleo Medicina Clinic in Hungary, in Budapest. So it's, we talk about carnivore, and it is a carnivore keto diet. But the emphasis is on high fat, high animal fat, moderate levels of protein, and including organ meats like liver on a regular basis. So that's the basis of it. But yes, and the other thing that really annoys me is if you go to the supermarket and look at the beef shelves, and they've got minced beef there, ground beef, and they're always selling it as though leanness is a good thing. So you might, they might say only 5% fat, and we have all these labeling, these traffic light labels where beef is marked with a red label because it's high in saturated fat. And so they reduce that saturated fat by cutting the fat out of the meat. The beef that I buy, the mince will be around about 25-30% fat. It's from regenerative native breed cattle, and it's delicious. It cooks well because of fat content, and and it just cooks in its own fat, and it is the fat that makes meat cook well, and it's also the fat that we need. Some people would describe humans as lipivores. We need to eat a high amount of saturated animal fat. So the whole story about saturated fat is completely upside down.
100%.
And this has had, I was just going to say, this has had major implications in our farming landscape in my working life. So it's this drive for lean meat, if you're going, or plant-based or at least lean meat, has driven us towards changing our cattle herds very drastically. So when I was at university, we were still using Hereford cattle a lot, and other British native breeds, Welsh Blacks and Angus cattle and South Devons and all these cattle. And our British native breeds, they tend to be smaller mostly than continental European breeds, and they tend to be fatter. So because it's mainly the heart hypothesis, the saturated fat hypothesis, that has driven a change. So by the time I had moved to Lincolnshire in the mid-80s, we were already seeing the suckler beef herds changing to Charolais French cattle, or Limousin French cattle, Belgian blues, all these continental breeds, because they were lean, because they have less fat content. And it's this health issue that we now know is completely wrong, that was driving that change of our livestock, plus the fact that they grow bigger, you've got bigger carcasses, but they are more dependent on grains. So you have to feed, we feed very little grain actually in suckler beef farming and sheep farming, but you might need to feed a bit more grain to in the final finishing part of the production period for a continental animal, compared with our native breeds, which are really suited to regenerative farming. So a lot of regenerative farmers will have Galloways or Angus, or and the Angus has been improved, say in inverted commas, where they've had a bit of Limousin added to it, because I mean the Angus is world famous for the quality of beef, but this fat issue led breeders to add in Limousin and so on historically, and now we know we just don't need to do that. And the other thing that it's very sad is that throughout my working life, when cattle go to the abattoir for slaughter, the farmer gets paid on a classification, and the classification is composition, which means the muscling, the muscling of the animal. So, you know, if you've got a black and white dairy animal, its conformation is very poor. It's very angular and skinny and not much muscle on the rear end. Whereas a Hereford animal or an Angus animal will be much more muscled and better for beef. But the other thing about it is the fact that they are classified according to how fat they are when they go for slaughter. And the farmer would be penalised if they were over a certain fat level. And even then, even if, you know, if the farmer was hitting the target exactly, in the processing of the carcass, a lot of the fat is trimmed off. So around about 10% of the carcass will be trimmed off, the weight of fat that's coming off the beef carcass. And because of this stupid story that animal fat is bad for us, we should be eating that fat. It won't go to waste. It'll be used for other things like in pet foods. But we should be eating that fat, and we should be eating nose to tail with the organ meats and everything else.
So, 100%. I completely agree. Alison, I think, you know, we need to get you on for another episode. I'm conscious of your time. Look, this has been fantastic. If you're up for it, I'd love to get you back on.
Yeah, certainly.
What piece of advice could we tie this up with really quickly in regards to someone who's looking to make better choices? What would you advise somebody to do in regards to making these better decisions?
I would say I understand that none of us wants to kill or harm animals. And none of us wants to cause environmental damage. But I would say if you want to follow a diet that is good for your health, good for your children's health, good for your granny's health, and look after the environment and look after animal life, then eat pasture-reared beef and lamb and make that the mainstay of your diet. Think about try to minimize the amount of plant foods that you eat. Definitely cut out grains and all vegetable oils. Eat animal fat. Use animal fat to cook in, especially pasture-reared beef fat, and try to buy regeneratively produced pasture-reared meat. I eat eggs, and you know, as we've said, there are problems with egg production because they tend to be highly grain-based. There are some egg producers that are going to a more regenerative style, and they depend on cattle to make them more regenerative because they follow the cattle around the pastures and eat the beetles and insects that the cattle dung encourages. And that helps them reduce the amount of grains that they need to feed by about half. So when I can get those, I go for those kind of eggs. I know that for my health, I should give up dairy. I find it very hard to give up dairy. I find it very hard to give up tea and coffee. But we all have to do what's sustainable for us. So think very hard about the environmental and animal impacts of your diet. Get educated, and the best diet for both of those is pasture-reared beef and lamb, and not plants. Definitely not a vegetarian diet, because the animal foods that you are eating are the most intensively produced and the most welfare damaging animal, so people just think that, oh, if I go vegetarian or vegan, that's it. And they don't think any further, so they're just buying any old eggs, any old milk, that sort of thing. And we need to recognize that our farmers deserve to make a living, a decent living. And if we want them to farm in a way that is good for the environment, good for animals, then we need to make sure that they are properly compensated for their work, because it's a hard working life.
Yeah, I agree. I couldn't have said it better myself. Alison, where can people find you, and where can they purchase your incredible book?
Yes, I'll just show you. This is the cover of the book.
I have one.
And it's available from most bookshops, waterstones.com, Amazon, of course. It's available currently as a hardback, a paperback, and an ebook, so you can get it on Kindle or whatever. We are thinking about doing an audio book, but we haven't got around to that yet. We have a website, www.whyveganshavesmallerbrains.com, I think. So you can find us there, and we have various social media which you can find via that website, and you can buy the book via the website. So yeah, that's it really.
Fantastic. And I will pop all of those links below.
That's
Alison,
lovely. Thank you very much.
It's been incredible chatting. That's been super educational. I've learned a lot. Definitely like to get you back on if you're up for that.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think there's lots more that we can delve into. We've just scratched the surface there, haven't we? But brilliant having you on. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Take care, and I will speak to you soon.
Thanks very much. Bye.